Welcome back to Season 3 of the How to Japanese podcast. This is the Murakami season. I've had a week or so to digest the news about the title of Murakami Haruki's new novel, and I still can't believe he's digging this far back into his extensive bibliography for inspiration. If you missed last week's episode, his publisher Shinchosha announced that Murakami is taking the title of a 1980 novella he wrote, Machi to Sono Futashika Nakabe is the title, and repurposing it as the title of his new novel. This is a novella that he already rewrote and turned into the 1985 novel Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. I was originally planning on starting this season with this episode, but given all the background information I had about the novella, I wanted to put out an immediate reaction. Please go give it a listen if you haven't yet. I also sent out a newsletter with a more polished version of basically all that content, so give that a read as well. I don't think people have fully realized exactly what the title choice implies, but hopefully I was able to provide some context. It'll be interesting to see if there's any more detailed reporting about the title as we get closer to the publication date. So far, I'm not seeing much beyond perhaps they're connected in the English language press. In the Japanese press, writers have dug up a tie-down between the two Murakamis where Haruki mentions Richard Brautigan's novel In Watermelon Sugar, and a quote from an academic that mentions the Kawaguchi Daisaburo incident at Waseda, which was a killing by revolutionary Marxists that may have set the tone for the novella, or at least that's what the academic implies. It'll be interesting to see what other connections are made in the coming month. The one phrase that the Japanese press seems to have settled on is Maboroshi no Sakuhin, the phantom work of writing. This, of course, refers to the fact that this novella has never been published in book form, and that the only way you can access it now is to find a back issue of Bungakukai. My original inspiration for this season of the podcast was actually puppet theater. This past January, I went to the National Bunraku Theater here in Osaka to see a showing of Yoshitsune and the Thousand Cherry Blossoms. The theater was decorated with two giant red sea bream above the stage to celebrate the new year, and many of the audience were wearing kimono to celebrate their visit. I settled into the play with a headset that provides commentary in modern Japanese, and I managed to stay awake despite the meditative atmosphere created by chanting and traditional shamisen music. I did, however, daze off into my thoughts several times, and at one point I had a bizarre premonition. Haruki Murakami is going to publish a new novel soon. I don't know why I was thinking about Murakami at that moment, other than that it's possible I'm constantly thinking about Murakami and his writing somewhere in the recesses of my mind at any given point. I've been obsessed with his writing ever since I first discovered Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World at a bookstore in New Orleans as a teenager in 1999. So much so that I decided to study Japanese so I could read his original novels. Since 2005's After Dark, I've read the Japanese editions of all his works before they've been released in English, and I've written reviews for the Japan Times and the web journal Neo-Japanism since 1Q84 in 2009. I've had mixed feelings about his last few books, so I think it's fair to say that I've become a more realistic critic than the Murakami fanatic I was in my 20s. Once I started to mull over my premonition, it made sense. It's been 6 years since his last novel, Killing Commendatore, which was published in 2017. In that time, he's put out a story collection, translated a dozen different books into Japanese, written nonfiction work about his father, his favorite t-shirts, and classical music, and started DJing a radio program called Murakami Radio. Basically, he's been prolific as an artist in every other area other than extended fiction, so clearly he was quietly and consistently putting down words for a novel just like he's done his whole career. But historically, he hasn't needed much time to write. In the afterword to Dance Dance Dance, for example, he mentions that it only took him 4 months to write the book. I was so convinced by my premonition that on the train home from Bunraku, I logged into the Japanese marketplace app Mercari and started looking for used copies of his work. I thought it might be cool to read through his bibliography in chronological order to prep for the new novel. I found someone selling almost a full set of his books for 5,400 yen, around $40 at the time of writing. This worked out to something like $1.50 each for 30 books or so. A lot of his novels are multiple volumes, and the set also included some of his nonfiction writing. I bought it and paid for it at a convenience store when I got off the train. 2 days later, the book showed up in a cardboard box labeled Mecha Nagai Toilet Paper, super long toilet paper. I think this was the universe telling me what it thought about his writing. I started reading Hear the Wind Sing that day, and then sure enough, 2 weeks later, on February 1st, Shinchosha announced that Murakami would be releasing a new novel on April 13th. My first reaction was, no, I need more time. I zipped through Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973 and was working on a Wild Sheep Chase at the time of the announcement, but I knew I wouldn't have enough time to do my full project, let alone put together comprehensive thoughts about all of his works. One of the reasons for this is that Murakami has been insanely prolific since his debut in 1979. I think everyone, even his haters, recognizes that he's been incredibly consistent in his production. But the true scope of his work isn't well known abroad, especially in English-speaking countries. Murakami has been more widely translated in Chinese and Korean in particular, and his nonfiction works have gone into many other languages, but not as much into English. That's where this podcast comes in. My goal, other than to share my love of his writing and to kind of hype up the book release a little bit and eventually give my thoughts on it, is fourfold. I hope to show that Murakami is far more prolific than he appears to be, even though that is extremely prolific, that he has written a far more diverse set of writing than has appeared in English, that he has had an evolving identity as a writer, and finally that the Japanese publishing industry is kind of miraculous in the volume of material it puts out. There's an appetite for the written word in Japan that rivals any country in the world. The core of this podcast will be a chronological look at what he's published. I'm dividing his career into 3 sections, from his debut in 1979 to the 1987 publication of Norwegian Wood, from 1987 to the publication of After Dark in 2005, and then from After Dark through Killing Commendatore in 2017 and on to the present. Today is just a short introductory follow-up to my emergency episode last week, which has thrown off my schedule entirely. Other than the chronological look at his publication history, I'll take a close look at his famous origin story, give my Murakami power rankings, talk more about my expectations for the book, and specifically the kind of language we can expect to see. And if all goes well, I'll also provide an instant reaction to the first chapter or the first few pages of the book immediately after it gets published. And then we'll see what happens from there. It'll probably take me 2 to 3 weeks to read the book. I read Killing Commendatore in 23 days, including several days of doing nothing but reading the novel. 1Q84 took me 19 days for the first 2 volumes. Those were both substantially longer than this new novel will be. Before I leave you today, I did want to provide a little more information about the 1980 novella and Hardball Wonderland and the End of the World. In the last episode, I mentioned the additional commentary that Murakami provided for the Complete Works publication. Unfortunately, my copy of his Complete Works is back in the US. But last week, I'd forgotten that I'd done a close look at a passage from that commentary on my website, which I'll link in a blog post. So I'll give that translation here. Here's my translation of what Murakami had to say about that novella in 1991, 11 years after writing it. I had only a very faint image of the structure of the novel when I started writing. I had only decided to rewrite and expand The Town and Its Uncertain Wall, a novella or maybe a long short story that I wrote for Bungakukai a little while before, but I had no plan whatsoever for the direction I would take in rewriting it. I wrote the story The Town and Its Uncertain Wall after Pinball 1973, but it was premature for me to write on those themes. I wasn't yet equipped with the abilities to write on themes like that. I realized this myself immediately after I finished writing. I was disappointed with what I'd done. I think I probably shouldn't have published it. But in a different light, my desire to rewrite it and turn it into something more respectable might have grown even stronger precisely because I put it into print. If I hadn't published The Town and Its Uncertain Wall at that time, Hardball Wonderland and The End of the World might have become an entirely different book from what it is now. For the publication of this Complete Works, my publisher requested that I include The Town and Its Uncertain Wall, but I didn't want to. A failed work is a failed work, even if it was ambitious, and the writer hopes it was. I didn't want it to be exposed to public scrutiny once again. I would ask that readers who absolutely must read it, please find a back issue of Bungakukai in the library and read it there. So Murakami must feel like he's developed the skills to take the material in a different direction. Over the next few episodes, I'll be looking at how we got to this point, 44 years after he first started writing fiction. And I'll end with the reminder that if you're in Japan and are registered with the National Diet Library, you can order a printed copy of the novella from a back issue, and they'll mail it to you with an invoice you can pay after it's delivered. My Japanese copy is back in the US, so I have a fresh new one en route to me right now.